And finally, but definitely not least, Dr. Shadi Hamid. Thanks for joining.
Okay, hello everyone. So I'll maybe just start off by saying that it is hard to talk about these issues. I think our previous speakers have kind of captured the sense of disillusion and perhaps even despair that a lot of us feel when we look at the last 20 years or so. I actually was just thinking, I hadn't thought about this in some time, but I actually remember a workshop that Radwan and CSID organized. I think it was in December 2004 in the Dead Sea in Jordan. And that was during the time of the Freedom Agenda, the Bush administration. And I think we were quite a bit more optimistic then than we are almost 20 years later. I mean, for all the terribleness of George W. Bush, I do remember that moment, and I was living in Jordan at the time, that there was a sense of possibility. And then, of course, there was a sense of possibility again in 2011. And here we are. Okay, so that's depressing. Let me try to, over the next 10 minutes or so, try to maybe get closer to something constructive or maybe even vaguely inspiring. We'll see. But, okay, so I think that, as Waddle said, what US policymakers are obsessed with is for the Middle East to be quote unquote stable and not a source of conflict. And, at this point, whenever I use the word stable or stability in the context of the Middle East, I always put it in scare quotes because this is a myth. This is the myth of authoritarian stability. So even on the very narrow grounds of wanting the Middle East to be stable, US policy fails on that count. That's the important thing we have to remember. Can we look at the Middle East over the past few decades, really from the 50s and 60s onwards, and say that US support for authoritarian regimes has led to a stable region? The empirical record is clear and unmistakable. So it's remarkable to me that we still have to have this debate about stability. Perhaps US policy does promote stability in the short term, but it obviously doesn't in the medium to long term. And I would have thought, perhaps naively, that with the Arab Spring in 2011, it would finally and definitively put this idea to rest. Because what was the Arab Spring? It was an indictment of our stability first policy. It didn't work, and it led to mass uprising, civil conflict, the rise of terrorism, and I very much agree with Webb. Donald Trump, in my view, was elected because of the failures of the Obama administration as it relates to Syria and the rest of the Middle East. If we had intervened militarily against Assad, I think we could have imagined a counterfactual history that would have been quite different in Europe and in the US. So, and I'll get to Obama in a second. But, so with all of that in mind, I think the case is still quite strong that supporting democracy in the Middle East is, of course, moral, but I've kind of lost hope in the notion that appeals to morality are going to be persuasive to US policymakers. So I do think it is still important for us to really emphasize the longer term argument. And I think it's intuitive, and it's also worth noting that I think a lot of Biden administration folks and Obama administration folks, they understand this intellectually, but they don't act on it, that authoritarian regimes are inherently unstable. That they seem stable until they're not, and then it's too late. And you might recall that none other than Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said 2 weeks before Mubarak fell on February 11th, 2011, the exact quote is this: our assessment is that the Egyptian regime is stable. She said that 2 weeks before everything happened. So this should just give us some, it's worth reminding ourselves of that, because things can change very quickly. And we have to prepare ourselves for that moment when the Arab world experiences mass uprisings again, because we're gonna be having the same debates all over again. The same debates we were having in 2011, the same debates we were having in 2005 during the Freedom Agenda, and I was too young then, but I presume the same debates other people were having in 1992 with the Algerian coup. And again, thinking about counterfactual histories, if US and European policy was different in 1991 and 1992 in Algeria, you know, it is an interesting thought. What if the Algerian experiment was allowed to proceed? What would we have learned? What would have happened? So this leads me to the question of personnel versus structure. So Well talked about how many US policymakers are not values aligned. I think that's right. You know, for my most recent book, I did something around 30 interviews with senior officials who work on the Middle East in the previous administrations, including some very key people who were with Obama at key moments during the Arab Spring. And they're not necessarily bad people. Actually, some of them I like, and some of them do have a sense of morality. So it is an interesting question of what the gap is. Some of it has to do with, I think, a sense of hopelessness or disdain even when it comes to the Middle East. So, like, when you really push them, and this was true of Obama, and I'll mention a couple quotes from Obama in a second, that there is a kind of pathologizing of Arabs. And it's surprising that it comes from left-leaning members of the Democratic Party, because, you know, you'd think that they wouldn't do that. But if you do look back at Obama's, and I'll just mention a couple of them. Sorry? Yes, the Atlantic, the Jeffrey Goldberg Atlantic profile from 2016. It's worth a reread. It's actually incredible, the things that Obama said in that interview, and kind of outrageous. Okay, so it was reported in that article that Obama was known to privately joke, here's the quote, "All I need in the Middle East is a few smart autocrats." And Obama wondered out loud why people in the Middle East couldn't just, quote unquote, be like the Scandinavians. He complained that a growing number of Indonesian women were wearing the headscarf. He also put some blame on Muslims for not being sufficiently peaceful. And the quote that he has in that interview is that Muslims need to, quote unquote, undergo a vigorous discussion within their community about how Islam works as part of a peaceful modern society, implying that it's not, Muslims don't do peaceful modern societies all that well. He also spoke of a, quote unquote, reformation that would help people adapt their religious doctrines to modernity. Basically, that Arabs and Muslims have to experience a reformation before anything else can really happen. Then there was the classic quote from his State of the Union that conflicts in the Middle East are, quote unquote, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia. So we're pathologized. This has been going on for thousands of years, and it'll probably continue for thousands of years. And it just worth, you know, sometimes we look back and we long for the days of Obama. Obama had a very particular view about Arabs and Muslims, and I think it is replicated to some degree among a lot of left-leaning Democrats. But I think that only takes us so far, because even if you do have good, well-meaning people in government, the structure around them is very constraining. They're operating under a certain orientation towards the Middle East that has been in place since the 1950s. If you want to fight that, you're fighting an uphill battle. And we have examples of people who tried to fight it. George W. Bush, there's a really interesting thing that George W. Bush said at a conference in Prague in 2007. Some of you might remember this, was reported in the Washington Post. He was talking to Shadi Hamid, my old teacher, and I know many of you know him. Someone who did unfortunately turn against democracy in Egypt at key moments, but putting that aside, so Bush says to Shadi Hamid, I'm a dissident just like you. When I try to fight for democracy, I feel like I'm stuck because of the bureaucracy around. He was the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States of America, and he was on the sidelines of a conference complaining, and he called himself literally a dissident in his own administration. So this gets to, I think, and this will hopefully lead me to kind of close with something constructive. I think we really have to look long-term here. We have to look at the structure of U.S. policy. And the whole US-led regional order in the Middle East is oriented and aligned around authoritarian regimes at the most foundational level. The only way this can change is to fundamentally reorient the entire thrust of our Middle East policy. It's not enough to tinker around the margins. I mean, I think a lot of us do it because it's better to do something than nothing. And I just had a meeting with a key person who works on who oversees Tunisia policy in the administration. And after that, I was like, part of me feels like I'm just done with all this. But we do the best that we can, and we try. That's what we have to do when the rest is out of our hands. But when we're thinking medium to long term, we have to think about how is the structure of US policy actually going to change? And I don't necessarily have the best answer for that. I do think some of it has to do with a new generation of policymakers and activists and writers and people who work on the Middle East, and that if those people become more prominent, and if there is another opening in, say, 10 or 15 years, where there is something resembling an Arab Spring again, that we will be ready at that key moment. And we have to look ahead to that moment. And I'm thinking about 10 to 15 years for a reason. That's actually because if you look at the worst moments of the last few decades in the Middle East, the Hama massacre in Syria in 1982, or the Algerian coup in 1992, it took Syrians from 1982 to 2011 to be able to muster once again the courage to stand up to the brutality of the Assad regime. It took 29 years. It took Algerians, after their terrible civil war, about 25 years, until 2017, before they were able to have mass protests again. Now, I hope we don't have to wait 25 years this time, but it could be a long wait. So that means we have time, and I think the work has to continue, and we have to be patient. And I know that's not maybe the most encouraging or inspiring thing one can say in a conference like this, but it is better, I think, in many ways for us to have a longer time horizon, because otherwise we're going to get disillusioned. If we want results right now, if we want the Biden administration to change in 1 month or 2 months or later this year, we're setting ourselves up for failure and disappointment, because it's probably not going to happen. So the question is, what comes next? So I'll end there. Thank you.